All right. Okay, we are good to go. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to Planting for the Pollinators. My name is Erin Garrett, and I'm an Extension Educator in Energy and Environmental Stewardship. And I'm based way down in Southern Illinois and serve the southernmost 5 counties. But I am originally from Northern Illinois, so I've spanned across the whole state, and this information will be relevant for all of you, no matter where you're joining from. So we'll go ahead. Let me get my first slide moving. All right, so I just wanted to start by going through a roadmap of what we're going to be covering today. So the first thing that we're going to do is start with a discussion on the different groups of pollinators that we have in Illinois and throughout the country, and talk about what their floral preferences are. So what types of flowers are they looking to visit and why? We're then going to move into a short discussion of what native plants are and why we should consider planting them for the pollinators. After we go through those background informations, we're going to put those pieces together and go through some specific examples of pollinator-plant relationships. So for example, if you know of a specific butterfly that you want to attract to your garden, what plants would you put in your garden to do so? So we'll go through a number of different examples for you, just so you have some basis to go back on. And then we'll touch on just a few planting considerations when it comes to putting native plants into your home garden, just to wrap things up at the end. Okay, so when many of us hear the word pollinator, there's kind of 2 groups that come to mind. So we typically think of bees and butterflies when we think of pollinators. But what I want you to notice is there are many other groups of pollinators that we have throughout the world. So including moths and wasps, flies and beetles. Those might not be the first groups of insects that you would think would be pollinators. We also have birds and bats. Now, not in Illinois, we don't have any bats that pollinate in Illinois, but it's important to mention that if you love chocolate, then you love that bats are pollinators. And we do only have one pollinating bird in Illinois, and that's the ruby-throated hummingbird. But like I said earlier, we're gonna take an in-depth look at each of these pollinator groups right now and take a look at their diversity, because there's a lot more there than we might realize. So let's start with the bees. So we have over 4,000 species of bees that are native to the United States. Now in Illinois alone, it's estimated that we have about 400 to 500 different species of bees. That's a lot of bees. So it might be difficult for us to wrap our head around how we would even start to distinguish between a few hundred different species of bees. But there's a few easy ways that we can group bees. So one way is by how they nest, so their nesting type. Many of us think of bees as cavity nesters, but the majority of our bees actually nest in the ground. And some of these characteristics that we'll talk about will be important and will come into play when it comes to planning a native plant garden in your home, okay? So all of this is kind of food for thought that we'll all piece together when we think about putting those native plants in our garden. Okay, so we have a lot of ground nesting bees. But we can also group bees by their sociality, okay? Again, most of us think of bees as being social creatures, but only 10% of bees are social, okay? So most bees are actually solitary ground nesting bees, despite our popular belief that they're not those 2 things, okay? And then my favorite way to group bees, just because it seems so bizarre when you first think of it, is by their tongue length. Okay, so we have bees that are long-tongued and bees that are short-tongued. Now, I thought I had never seen a bee tongue before, but I was looking through some photos I had taken, and I had this picture here, and I was actually trying to take a picture of the flower, this vervain here, and when I looked back at those pictures, found that I had caught a bumblebee in flight in the corner. And when I took a closer look, I can see a very long, distinct tongue on that bee. So you might have not realized that you could even see a bee tongue before, but bumblebees as a group are long-tongued bees, and that's just another way that we can distinguish them, and that will really be an important characteristic when we look at the different types of flowers that bees like to visit. But before we do that, let's take a look at some pictures and just develop an appreciation for the diversity of bees that we have. So the first one I'm going to start with is not a native bee. So I just want to put a word out there for our honeybees. Those are the bees, again, many of us think of when we picture a bee in our head. Just noting that they are not a native species. Very, very important to our crop food systems. Honeybees are fantastic helpers and we definitely need them around. But what we're trying to focus on today is supporting all those other bees that people don't really realize that are out there, okay? So we love the honeybees, but let's look at what else we've got, okay? So we have some bumblebees, okay? And the bumblebee, there are many, many different species of them, okay? And what I want you to notice in this picture is all of the hairs. You can see all of those individual hairs on this bumblebee and those individual pollen grains that are all sticking to him. So again, this just starts to give you a deeper appreciation for how effective of a pollinator these bumblebees can actually be, okay? So we've got bumblebees. We've got ones called cuckoo bees. Now we start to get into the ones that you may not have heard of before. Okay, so cuckoo bees are a type of bee that get their name because they parasitize the nests of other bees, just like some types of cuckoo birds parasitize the nests of other birds, okay? So again, it looks like a bee. He looks a little bit scruffier, so you might not put it together right when you see him. But that's one of the different bees that we have. We also have a leafcutter bee. This is one that reminds me of leafcutter ants. So he also will go around, cut out pieces of leaves and collect those pieces and bring them back to his nest. An interesting fact about this guy is he collects pollen on the underside of his abdomen. So we can't see it in this picture, but the underside of his abdomen is extremely, extremely hairy. So unlike some of our other bees that will collect the pollen in baskets on their legs, he's going to collect it on the bottom of his abdomen. Whoops. All right. These guys here are called longhorned bees, and they get their name because the males have very long antennae that you can see here. And despite how they're grouped in this picture, they are actually solitary ground nesting species of bees. Okay. Next up is the small carpenter bee, and I like this one because he's the first example of a pollinator that doesn't look like the typical picture of that pollinator that we have in our head, okay? So he's all green, he doesn't have any yellow or black stripes on him. So we're soon going to start to see beetles that look like bees and flies that look like wasps and wasps that look like bees but are called wolves. Just bear with me, we'll get there. But it's a really interesting lesson in mimicry and how all of these insects can fool other creatures that may want to predate on them, and so are either trying to blend in or trying to look like something else so that they get away. So this small carpenter bee, he's one of our small green bees that we have. We also have a whole bunch of different metallic green bees and sweat bees. These guys range from either just part of their abdomen being green and metallic to their full body being green and metallic. Okay, so we know that we see these all the time. We might not have connected that they're a bee. So again, something that doesn't look like a bee that is a bee. Okay. All right, so we've looked at different types of bees, but what types of flowers are they looking to visit? And this is where distinguishing between short and long-tongued bees comes in handy. So our short-tongued bees are going to prefer to visit open, shallow, composite flowers in general. So something like that geranium in the bottom left-hand corner, okay? They don't have a long tongue, so it's harder for them to work down into more complex flowers. Now our long-tongued bees, on the other hand, they're able to access nectar that's more hidden and more difficult to reach. They will also visit those shallow flowers, but often there's less competition at the more complex flowers. So then they're going to go there and be collecting their nectar from those flowers, like that baptisia flower in the bottom right corner. Okay, when it comes to color preferences, In general, they prefer to visit pink, blue, and purple flowers, but I know I've seen bees on all different colored flowers. So yes, they're going to visit yellow and white flowers. Yes, they're going to visit other colors of flowers. These are just some preferences that have been noted. So any of these flowers that you can see here are going to be great ones that they're easily attracted to. But another thing to note with bees is besides just using color, they're going to use something called a nectar guide. Okay, and a nectar guide is a UV contrast in light or in color, we could say, that the bees are able to pick up on, but it's not something that we can see with our naked eye, okay? So in this example here, what we would see is that yellow flower on the left, and it just looks like a yellow flower to us, but what the bee detects is going to be that contrasting color with that really dark tubular, kind of funnel-shaped band that helps guide them down to where the nectar is located. Another example is in this black-eyed Susan. We can see that really dark, exaggerated black spot that helps guide that bee to the center where the nectar is located. So again, something that we would never know is there, but when you put this under UV light, is very striking and very apparent, and will help them find that nectar. Okay, just a few other traits to note on bee-pollinated flowers. They prefer to visit flowers that have sticky and scented pollen often that helps stick to their bodies. Those flowers do have nectar because that's why they're there. They're there to collect that nectar. And oftentimes those flowers have a fresh and mild odor, okay? Not a key characteristic, but just a trend that's been noted. Okay, so moving on from the bees to the wasps. And the first few times I did this talk, I didn't have the wasps listed under a pollinator group. And one time we went on a pollinator walk, and by and large, the thing we saw the most of was wasps. So I knew I had to dig a little bit into that and add them in here. So just like the bees, there are 4,000 species of wasps in the United States. Again, we can group them by their sociality. Okay, so we have social wasps. These are typically the ones that we don't really want around our yards. We're not too excited to have them there. Those are the ones that are going to nest in a paper nest, be in a colony. They can get aggressive if they're provoked, okay? But there is a whole nother group of wasps that are solitary wasps, and they're docile, and they're going to nest in the ground or in a stem or in mud, okay? So again, kind of shifting our perspective to consider that it's not just all those yellow jackets that we don't want to have around. There are other docile wasps that would not be a problem to have in our garden, okay? Wasps can visit flowers for two different reasons. So they can visit flowers to collect nectar, okay? Many of our wasps do feed on nectar, but oftentimes we also find wasps just hanging around flowers because they're looking for prey, okay? So many of our wasps are gonna be collecting other insects, other caterpillars to act as their food source or to collect to bring back to their nests. Okay, so again, let's look at some examples, and we're going to start with the ones that we typically don't want to see. So starting with our yellow jacket wasp, and I put him on here because I want you to look at all of the hairs that he has on him. Wasps are not typically recognized as being potential pollinators because a lot of people think that they're not that hairy. We do have some examples of wasps that aren't that hairy, but even looking at this guy right here, we can see a multitude of hairs that are all over his body. Okay, another one we're not too excited to see is the paper wasp. Here we kind of see more of that stereotypical, not very hairy body in a wasp. But let's look at some more pleasant ones that we have. We have the grass-carrying wasp. And here we can see him. He's actually working his way through this piece of twine to bring back to his nest to furnish that. But starting to look at his body, we can see all of those hairs on him as well, okay? Different colored body, not our stereotypical looking wasp. Okay, we have mason wasps as well. He's going to be more of a solitary wasp, more docile to have around. We can see him pollinating one of the really popular wasp flowers, which is a mountain mint. Okay. And I told you that there was going to be a wasp that looks like a bee and is named a wolf. So this is our bee wolf. and we can see he looks like a bee. He's called a bee wolf because he is she, the females furnish their nests by hunting caterpillars and other bees. So he is called a bee wolf because he hunts bees to bring back to his nest for the eggs to eat once they hatch. Okay, when it comes to wasp-pollinated flower traits, what are they looking for? Oftentimes, we're going to find lots of small flowers arranged in a large head, okay? And all of these flowers are going to have shallow corollas. So the corolla is the part of the flower that's the arrangement of the petals, okay? So the petals can be arranged to form a tube, or they can be very open and flat, kind of like that geranium we saw earlier on the bee page. Okay, so typically they don't have long tongues, they don't have a proboscis like a butterfly, so they can't access really deeply hidden nectar. So flowers like these on this page, this bone set that we can see on the left, where there's numerous small shallow corollas all arranged together. There are, not necessarily in Illinois, I haven't seen too many examples, but in some other countries, there are some flowers that have adapted, that are pollinated by wasps, that have adapted to mimic wasp prey. And so they're then tricking that wasp to come and collect their pollen because the wasp is visiting that flower because it thinks it's going to get a prey item. When it comes to color, they're often seen on white and yellow flowers. Some favorites I mentioned earlier, mountain mint, we've got on here again, quinine, goldenrod, and rattlesnake master. All are going to be very good wasp attractants. And another really cool relationship, kind of a three-way relationship with wasps, is some wasps that are hunting as predators can actually pick up on something called a green leaf volatile. And this is a compound that a plant releases when it's being eaten by another insect. So if we have a caterpillar that is sitting on a leaf and it's eating that leaf like they do, that plant is going to put out this compound called a green leaf volatile, and wasps can detect that and track it back to the plant to then find caterpillars that they can predate on, okay, and eat or bring back to their nest. So I've thought that was very fascinating relationship, and just wanted to point that out. Again, wasps can be visiting to collect for nectar, but also they can visit to be hunting for prey. Okay, let's move on to our butterflies. And in North America, we have about 825 species of butterflies, about 150 to 200 in Illinois. So a much narrower window of species to look through and try to identify and figure out what you have in your garden, okay? We say that butterflies are active during the day. That's mostly true. There are some that are active at night though. And the way that I tell a butterfly apart from a moth is that they have club-shaped antennae. And so hopefully you can see that in this picture of the butterfly here, that at the end of his antenna, it looks like the ends are swollen or a little bit larger. Okay, so that forms that club shape. Moths, on the other hand, are going to have feathery antennae, and we'll look at that in a few slides. This butterfly here is one of my favorite types. He is a question mark butterfly. If you're not familiar with him, you can see hopefully a white marking on his hind wing there that looks like a sideways question mark. We also have one that looks similar that's called a comma. So that's a fun fact on those butterflies. A few other species that we have in Illinois are the mourning cloak. I love him because he has that really regal looking gold edging on his wings. We have red spotted purples. We have red admirals. This one you can really see the hairs that he has along his body and along his wings. And then one of my personal favorites is the zebra swallowtail. Have these in southern Illinois, not so much once you get up mid-state and up into northern Illinois. Okay, so what type of flower is a butterfly looking to pollinate? Well, they can pollinate deep or shallow corollas, okay? So tubular flowers and more flat flowers. They're often seen on composite flowers like this coreopsis in the bottom right-hand corner, that yellow flower. And that's because there's a whole array, like a whole dish of different options for him to eat from, okay? So if you had, you know, a bunch of different cups all full of nectar and you can just stick your proboscis from one to the next to the next to the next really easily, they really like that, okay? But they'll also access more tubular flowers like the blazing star on the left-hand side, okay? One thing to note with butterflies is they do need a landing pad. So whereas some of our other pollinators, like some of our bee species, are able to pollinate while flying, some species are able, it's called buzz pollination. Our butterflies do typically need to land and rest as they're feeding. Okay, when it comes to color, again, we've seen butterflies on every different color flower that we have in our garden, right? But some of the research shows, you know, purple and red are their preferences that they're going to prefer to visit. They also use nectar guides, just like our bees. And when it comes to the type of nectar that they're looking to collect, it's typically very abundant and very dilute. So if we get into more hot and humid days, if that nectar starts to get sticky or clog up, they're not able to get it up their proboscis just because it is so thin. So that's just something to note. I didn't realize that before, but they do really need that dilute nectar. Okay, so let's jump over to the moths. And we're going to get another big number here, 12,000 species in North America, several thousand in Illinois, it's thought. In general, you know, people think that moths are more drab colored. I like to show all the examples of the moths that aren't drab colored and that are very colorful that we have. There's many examples of moths that look pretty, you know, unremarkable, but we do have quite a few species that are pretty distinct. Again, people think that moths are active at night. I'm going to say mostly, but I've also seen lots of moths flying around during the day, so that's not necessarily very strict. Like I mentioned before, here I've got a nice chart that you can see that shows the difference between the antenna of butterflies and skippers, which are a type of butterfly, and our moths, okay? So moths are going to have feathery antenna. Sometimes the feathering is so fine that you can't really tell that it's there. So on that leftmost of those three moth antennae in that diagram, we can't really see any of those feathers on that antenna, but they are there under a microscope. So some examples that we have a Luna moth in the bottom. We have our rosy maple moth, if I'm speaking correctly, and we've got a sphinx moth. So all of those have really bright, brilliant colors. But let's look at a few more examples. A few years ago, I worked at a nature center and we had an insect trap that we put out at night that had a light on it. And it was my job to go out and collect whatever moths and insects that we caught the night before and identify them. So here are some pictures of the ones that we caught. We have the polyphemus moth here, one of our very large silk moths. We've got another silk moth, this pink striped oakworm moth. Okay, looks kind of like the rosy maple moth. We have this underwing moth, which at first glance with his wings closed didn't look that remarkable, but then he spread his wings and he had that brilliant red striping color that's just beautiful. And again, something you might not have noticed at first glance. Okay, and another one like that, our Virginia creeper sphinx moth. He's got that rust coloration on his underwings that you wouldn't see at first glance. So huge amount of diversity of moths. In general, moths can access tubular flowers, okay? Not all of them need a landing pad also, okay? Many times we see them on cream or white flowers, especially if they're pollinating at night, because that means that those flowers are visible to them, okay? The ones we have here, we have an agave on the left-hand side, and then on the right we have a hyacinth, okay? Some of them do have a really strong sweet odor at night that helps attract the moths to them, typically have ample, very deeply hidden nectar. One very common moth-pollinated flower that is not native and is invasive is our Japanese honeysuckle. So if you think about the characteristics of that flower, that is one that very much does attract moths. Again, that's not something that we want to be planting or promoting, but just that will help you get a picture of the characteristics of flowers that they prefer to visit. Okay, so we've kind of gone through some of the more common pollinators, but let's look at the flies. So when it comes to the number of species of flies, I didn't even look up that number because I know that it's huge. But when it comes to flies that will specifically visit a flower, there's about 900 species in the United States. Okay, many of them are going to have black and yellow stripes and be bee or wasp mimics, excuse me. One way that you can tell is that they do only have one pair of wings. So it might be difficult to tell that bees have two pairs of wings, but if you look very closely, you can see that distinction. And flies do have a modified second pair of wings. The name for that is escaping me right now. But once we start to look at these pictures, hopefully you can start to see some of those subtle differences. All right, let's look at some flies. We have a thick-headed fly. To me, at first glance, he looks like a wasp. He doesn't look like a fly. I have to look real close to tell that he's not a wasp. We've got this bee fly, one that looks very much like a long-tongued bee with that very, very, very exaggerated tongue. Okay, all of his hairs on his body. He is a very good mimic of a bumblebee, but he is indeed a fly. And then we have syrphid flies, very, very common flower visitors, very small. And I love this close-up picture because you can see all the tiny hairs that he has on his body that make him a great pollinator. All right, when it comes to, in general, types of flowers they like to visit, and I do want to put this out here, I'm saying all of these traits in general, but we know that nature doesn't always follow the rules. So there's always going to be certain species, certain exceptions. This is just kind of in general their preferences. So flat or bowl-shaped flowers and kind of two opposite color spectrums. Some flies will prefer to visit really dark brown, red, or purple flowers that kind of mimic rotting flesh. We know a lot of flies are attracted to animal carcasses, so flowers that mimic that and put out kind of a putrid, musky odor are going to attract some maybe different types of flies, but then also pale white and cream flowers are also going to attract our flies. Okay, moving on to the beetles. Our beetles are actually some of our earliest pollinators, and they're not the most sophisticated when it comes to pollinating. So they typically are kind of messy if they're going to visit your garden. So they're going to eat through all those flower petals, they're going to leave all their waste behind, and they're often attracted to more spicy, sweet, or fermented smells. So some examples here that we have, black blister beetles. They get their name because they do have a toxin. So if this beetle were crushed up against your skin, he does have the potential to give you blisters. We've got soldier beetles, also called leatherwings, often very prevalent visitors. And then we've got guys called tumbling flower beetles. Okay, so just a little look at their diversity. And again, when it comes to flower types that they like to visit, large bowl-shaped flowers, dull white or green in color. They can have a really strong scent, but they don't have to, and typically very easily accessible nectar. Now, these beautiful magnolia flowers that we have over here aren't going to look so beautiful after a beetle comes through and pollinates. They're going to look something more like this. So again, not something we're necessarily looking to attract to our garden, but just knowing that they're out there, they are working as pollinators and helping out our flowers. Okay, I just quickly want to mention our one bird pollinator that we have in Illinois, the ruby-throated hummingbird. This one is going to prefer large funnel-like flowers with a perch support for them to sit on, typically reds or oranges with ample nectar that's deeply hidden. So something like the Indian pink that we have on the bottom here, or even a trumpet creeper, those are going to be great flowers to attract the ruby-throated hummingbirds. Okay, and one last note, just remember that not all of our flowers are pollinated by a pollinator. Many of our flowers are wind-pollinated And because of that, their characteristics of their flowers are adapted for wind pollination, okay? So just want to put that note out there because sometimes we can get so narrowly focused on just those plants that need pollinators, but we do have a whole bunch of others that are wind pollinated, like our grasses and many of our trees. All right, so that was a quick look at some of our pollinator groups and what types of flowers they prefer to visit. Now let's talk a little bit about native plants, okay? So in general, the standard, rule of thumb to go by is native pollinators prefer native plants. And when it comes to our native insects that eat our plants, okay, 90% of those are only going to eat the plants with which they co-evolved. Okay, so if we have a native insect that eats our leaves, if his native plant isn't there, he's not going to be there either. So those native plants really do support our ecosystem function and either make or break our food webs. Okay, so what is a native plant? It's kind of a difficult definition because it depends on both time and location, okay? So we typically say, it's a plant part of the balance of nature. It's developed over at least hundreds of years in a given region or ecosystem, okay? The size of that region or ecosystem that you choose can vary, okay? So we can say that there are plants that are native to the United States, but just because it's native to the US doesn't mean I'd necessarily want to pick it to put in my native plant garden here in Illinois. And as I've quickly learned as I moved from Northern Illinois to Southern Illinois, that just because some plants are native to Illinois as a state doesn't mean that they're suited to grow down in Southern Illinois, okay? And vice versa. There's many things that grow in Southern Illinois that aren't typically found in Northern Illinois, so I wouldn't necessarily want to move those and plant them in Northern Illinois. So you can kind of go back to a specific time and you can change the scale of that region that you say a plant is native to, okay? But in general, if we take, at least Illinois as a state, we say that plants adapted to environmental range of conditions. So we have many, many native prairie plants because Illinois is known as the prairie state that are from this area and that would be great additions to put into your native plant garden. Okay, and then those native plants are going to interact with the other elements of the environment, support those native insects and native wildlife. Okay, one thing that I do want to point out when it comes to some of our pollinators, like our bees, or excuse me, like our butterflies and our moths, we need to make sure that we're supporting their entire life cycle. So when it comes to choosing native plants for our garden, we want to make sure that we provide the food source for the larval stage of that pollinator and the adult stage, okay? So we can differentiate those by calling them host plants and nectar sources, okay? So the host plant is the one that's going to provide the leaves and the food for the caterpillars, and the nectar sources are, of course, going to provide nectar. So if we want to do the best job, we need to provide both host plants and nectar sources for those insects in those groups. Okay, I do want to go through one quick comparison because I get this question a lot. I get a lot of people that ask me, well, I've got a whole bunch of non-native plants in my garden. Are they really not supporting the pollinators? Do I need to take them all out? What do I need to do? And I am by no means telling you to take your non-native plants out of your garden. I myself have non-native plants in my garden. I see pollinators on them and I don't want to get rid of them, okay? But when it comes to making changes in your landscape, I just want you to think about it and to just think about what your garden is contributing to the food web around you, okay? So we're just gonna do a quick comparison. Look at butterfly bush. I picked this comparison. We're gonna compare this one with a native plant because they both have the word butterfly in them, okay? So they're being marketed as attractive to our pollinators. So butterfly bush is a non-native. Out in California, it's being watched because it's been seen to form some dense thickets if it does get out. It is only a larval food source for one caterpillar, and it's a non-native caterpillar, okay? It originates from the same area as the butterfly bush. We know that those butterfly bushes are always covered with butterflies, okay? So they're providing nectar for adult butterflies. So very important food source. But maybe there's a different option. Maybe there's a comparison, okay? So let's look at our butterfly milkweed, if I can get my mouse to cooperate. Butterfly milkweed is a native species. Um, if we're familiar with milkweed and monarchs, we know that it's going to be a larval food source for the monarch caterpillar, but it also is a host plant for 13 other caterpillar species, okay? And it is seen being visited not just by butterflies, but also by bees, flies, wasps, and beetles, okay? So if we're thinking more holistically on how we can better support the food web as a whole, maybe if we're, deciding between adding in a butterfly bush or a butterfly milkweed, maybe making the choice for the native in this case, okay? So just wanted to point out that comparison. Again, no, you don't need to get rid of all your non-native plants, but just think about how maybe you can better help support the food web as a whole as you make changes to your garden. All right, just wanted to cover a couple other questions that I get about native plants and how we can distinguish between them. So one question I get a lot is when people ask about a nativar. So this is a cultivar of a native plant, okay? So if you go to the home improvement store in your town, and you're looking for native plants, often what you're going to find are nativars, okay? So it's challenging to find that true wild type at some of those big box stores. And what you're going to find many times is a nativar. You can tell that it's a cultivar because it has kind of a catchy name oftentimes. It's usually printed in single parentheses. That's one way you can tell the difference. And they're bred for many different reasons, okay? To improve the hardiness of the plant, change the aesthetics, change its growth form, make them insect or disease resistant. Now, if we want it to act as a host plant, we don't necessarily want it to be insect resistant if we want some of those leaves to be eaten, right? So this artificial selection can change some of the characteristics and make these plants not necessarily the preferred source for pollinators. So what I mean by that is if we look at this example of a yarrow on the right, that native yarrow is a white flower. You can see that in the top picture. There's a nativar that's changed the flower color, okay? We've talked about how certain groups of pollinators have color preferences, okay? So if we breed it to have a different color, we might lose some of that ability for that pollinator to find that flower. We might also lose the presence or absence of nectar guides, okay? If we change something that has to do with the leaves, maybe the pigments in the leaves, we can potentially make them unpalatable to our leaf-eating insects, okay? Many of those cultivars are sterile, so they're not gonna produce seeds to provide a food source for birds and other wildlife. And overall, we can start to reduce our genetic diversity. So if we're looking at picking between a nativar and the true wild type native, we wanna go and try to find that true wild type native if we can. Another thing that you want to do is try and buy those plants from a place where they're grown that's closest to home, okay? So within a single species, there are different ecotypes. So that means that just because there's a plant that's native to Illinois doesn't mean it doesn't grow other places. So I like to talk about big blue stem. Big blue stem grows in many, many states, all the way north in Minnesota, down to Tennessee, out to Kansas, and it's gonna grow differently in all of those different locations. So if you want your plant to perform the best in your yard, you wanna try and source it as locally as possible. Okay, and I think this is my last slide before we get to some examples. A lot of people ask about wildflower seed mixes. You can go, to the home improvement store and pick up a pollinator mix. Many times they have some Asian or European flowers mixed into them. They're not being marketed oftentimes as native pollinator mixes. They're just a wildflower mix, okay? But oftentimes, even if they don't have any European flowers in them, they can have, California poppy is a very, very popular flower in those seed mixes. Just because it's native to the US doesn't mean it's necessarily native to Illinois. Doesn't mean that's necessarily what we want to plant in our garden in Illinois. And it's probably not even going to grow the best here, okay? So again, just being mindful about what's in those seed mixes. I typically turn them over, look at the back, and I recognize maybe half of those flowers as being native to Illinois. And then I usually pass on it because that's not necessarily what I want in my garden. That might be a choice that you want and you're okay with, and that's fine. Again, lots of personal preference comes into this, but just want to increase your awareness to question things. Look at the label, see what's on there, see what's in that mix before you plant it. All right, so I don't have as much time as I wanted for this section, but we'll try to go through it pretty quick. We're just gonna go through some examples. We're gonna start with some examples of attracting some different butterflies and moths to our garden. So if you wanna attract this butterfly or moth, what should you plant in your garden? Okay, so we'll start with a Spicebush swallowtail. If we want to attract the adults to our garden, we can plant things like a jewelweed, milkweed, and dogbane. Okay, we do also have some non-native plants. That's what that double N means on the slide there, that will attract Spicebush swallowtails. So if you had thistles, you know, in your farm field, they are often found on thistles like in that picture there, or even azaleas, okay? But remember, we don't just want to support the adult. We want to see this caterpillar too, okay? So he is going to feed on the sassafras and spicebush leaves, okay? So one thing to think about when it comes to host plants, many host plants for caterpillars are trees or shrubs, okay? That might not be something that you're able to or willing to add into your home landscape, but it's something that you can also start to look around your neighborhood. Maybe you have a nature preserve nearby, maybe there's a park, maybe you have some street trees in your neighborhood. Look and see if any of these host plants are there. Then you can start to pair what host plants are there with what nectar sources you can provide for the adults to help close that food web and support the whole life cycle of those specific pollinators you're looking to attract. All right, we have another tiger, we have an eastern tiger swallowtail, excuse me. Also will visit milkweed, but things like Joe-Pye weed, wild cherry, lilac. I have a lilac in my yard, so don't feel bad. I have non-native plants too. If we want to support his caterpillar, there's a bunch of different tree species we could have, okay? So with this guy, you kind of get, if you plant a cherry, you can support both the caterpillar and the adult at the same time. So oftentimes there are some plants that will act as both a host plant and a nectar plant. So if you want to get more bang for your buck, you can look for those. We've got the American lady butterfly that will prefer to visit dogbane, a whole bunch of different asters, goldenrods, self-heal, common milkweed. We're already seeing milkweed a lot, so milkweed's a great choice. The caterpillar for the American lady is going to feed off of asters, ironweeds, plantain-leaved pussy toes. Some great choices. All right, let's look at some moths. And with the silk moths in particular, we luck out because they don't feed as adults. Okay, so they often emerge and they mate and then they die within 1 to 2 weeks. Okay, so in this case, we only have to provide a host plant. We only have to provide that food source for that caterpillar. And then we can start to look for some of those emerged adults. So with this Cecropia silk moth, a whole bunch of different trees that we can start to look for these caterpillars on, okay? So if we have a sugar maple in our yard, I have a sugar maple in my yard, I'm gonna start keeping my eye out for these caterpillars here and see if I can find any. When it comes to Luna moths, again, similar trees, lots of hickories, walnuts, sumacs, sweet gums, persimmons are all going to attract that Luna moth caterpillar, and then we can start to look for that adult form. All right, we've got the Io moth, hackberries, redbuds, even blackberries are going to be a great food source for this caterpillar. Just note, if you do see one of these caterpillars, please, please, please don't touch it. If you can't tell by how he looks, those spines have a very strong sting. I know from experience. And no, I wasn't trying to pick it up. I accidentally brushed my hand against it and I thought I got stung by a wasp. So if you do see him, very cool find, but just keep your distance on that one. Okay, rosy maple moth, his name is easy. He tells you what he wants to eat. That's gonna be our maple trees, okay? But they will also feed on oaks. All right, now we're going to flip that question around. So we're going to look at a number of different native plants. And I apologize, I'm kind of going through these quickly, but I spent too much time on the first half of the presentation. And we'll see, you know, if I plant this certain native plant, what pollinators can I expect to see? And this is where we're going to put together those preferences for what types of flowers those pollinators like to visit with what we can expect to find. Okay, so if we start with Columbine, as a host plant, it's going to support the caterpillars for a butterfly and for a moth. So these are the adult forms of those two that we can have, aptly named after the Columbine. As a nectar source, it's often found being visited by long-tongued bees, bumblebees, and sweat bees, and also hummingbirds. So we can see in some of those photos there, we know that long-tongued bees and hummingbirds, they can access the nectar that's found in those tubular flowers. It's a red flower, so it's attracting hummingbirds, okay? So putting all those pieces together, we start to see those relationships come together. All right, wild geranium is another great choice if you have a shady spot in your garden. It's going to support the caterpillars of the leaf mining moth and the white-marked tussock moth. That's the one that you can see pictured on the right there. Very fantastic looking caterpillar. And then as a nectar source, it's going to be visited by a whole bunch of different bees, a few different groups of flies. Fruitworm beetles are also going to be found visiting it. And I will note that these lists are not comprehensive. This is kind of where the research is at right now, those relationships that have been observed. But then I go and I find pictures like that bottom one that's got a potter wasp on the geranium, okay? So there's many, many relationships out there that we haven't even studied yet or made notes on. So just know that this is kind of just what we have right now, but that doesn't mean it's comprehensive by any means at all. Okay, yellow coneflower as a host plant. The wavy-lined emerald moth, also called the camouflaged looper, is going to be seen. And I love this caterpillar because he is able to pick up pieces of the plants that he is on and put them on his back to camouflage him as he's going around and eating, which I think is just a very smart move for that caterpillar. And as a nectar source, again, numerous different bees, several different moths and butterflies. We've got a couple types of wasps that are going to visit yellow coneflower, some flies. Typically, I see a ton of soldier beetles all over yellow coneflower. That's kind of the standard insect visitor that I see on that one. But let's compare with our purple coneflower. So purple coneflower hasn't really been studied to act as a host plant. And if you're familiar with it, you might realize that the leaves are very, very rough and sandpapery. There's many stiff hairs all along them, so not necessarily a great food source for caterpillars. But we know that it's loved by butterflies. Different swallowtails, the monarch, fritillaries are all going to visit our purple coneflower, along with many other bees and some beetles. Okay. Okay, Rattlesnake Master. I think this is a great choice and a great option if you want a plant that kind of looks and grows like a yucca. This Rattlesnake Master has very similar looking leaves, and I just think his flowers are so unique. Very, very different looking plant. He's going to provide food for these two caterpillars here of these moths. And then you can start to see he is very heavily preferred by wasps. So this is one that perhaps if you were planting it in a children's garden, you might want to pick a different one, not necessarily because it's going to attract wasps that can get aggressive, but just kind of that perception. If there's a lot of wasps flying around it, that could cause an issue. But just note that if you're okay having a lot of wasps around that are docile, this is a great one to plant for that. Okay. Bee balm is going to be a host plant, even though it's in the mint family. Its leaves are still preferred by a couple different caterpillars from some moths. and then it is going to be visited by a whole host of different pollinators, just like many of the others we've looked at. A couple that I want to point out is in that middle picture on the right, we can see a hummingbird clearwing moth. These are some of my favorite pollinators. If you haven't experienced one of them flying around you, it sounds just like a hummingbird. They're really, really fantastic pollinators to have. Okay, wild quinine is very similar to that rattlesnake master, being heavily preferred by wasps with all of those numerous white clustered flowers. But again, bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, beetles. We're going to have soldier beetles hanging out on them. Okay, so again, huge, huge diversity, much more than you might think at first look. Okay, but let's compare that to a foxglove beardtongue. Okay, here we have more tubular flowers, so that's going to limit the number of pollinators that are going to visit this flower. Okay, so we've got a couple bees that have longer tongues that are able to get in there. We've got a pollen collecting wasp. Some stryphid flies are able, but that number has been greatly reduced. Okay, mountain mint, another small white clustered flower, lots of wasps, numerous different bees, flies, beetles, butterflies. Okay, we're starting to get the theme, lots and lots of pollinators. New England Aster is going to support caterpillars from the pearl crescent butterfly and this Sonia moth that we have pictured here, and then act as a nectar source for, again, numerous different bees, several different butterflies, soldier beetles again, some flies and moths. Okay, spotted Joe-Pye weed is going to be a host plant for the three-lined flower moth caterpillar and the ruby tiger moth caterpillar, which is related to our woolly bear. And then he is heavily preferred by butterflies. Okay, so many, many different butterflies. Our endangered rusty patched bumblebee has been seen visiting Joe-Pye weed. All right, I think we're almost done with examples. Obedient plant, again, more tubular flower, so limited on what visitors he's going to have, but we've got several different bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. It's not a red flower, but that tubular shape has been known to attract some hummingbirds. Okay, so in the last couple minutes that I have, let's look at some planting considerations, and I'm just gonna bring up my notes real quick. So just like in any garden, you wanna make sure you have a variety of flower shapes, sizes, and bloom times, okay? So if you're able to plant flowers that'll bloom spring, summer, and fall, you can extend the amount of time that you can expect to find pollinators in your garden, okay? With native plant gardens, we really want to see clumps, large clumps of similar flowers, like in this diagram here, okay? A larger clump of flowers is going to be easier for those pollinators to find. Many of our native plant gardens need to be located in full sun, but we did look at a couple examples of native plants that are typically found in woodland areas and in the shade. So if you do want to do a native shade garden, there are many, many options out there. So definitely do a little research and look into that, because that is a possibility. When it comes to nesting locations, we talked about how many of our pollinators nest in on the ground, in the ground, excuse me. So having some bare ground is a great option, not necessarily putting down landscape fabric and mulching everything, but leaving some bare spots for some nesting locations. And one way that you can kind of have mulch control without mulching is if you do plant these really large clumps of flowers, the way that they grow, they're going to cover the ground and prevent weeds from growing, but still allow there to be bare ground underneath them that's not mulched, that acts as a nesting location, okay? You can consider putting in a water source for our pollinators. Of course, we want to reduce our chemical usage, both for the benefit of our plants and for our pollinators. Okay, and then again, just thinking about the pollinators that it's going to attract, and then pairing that with the proper location for that garden. So again, if you're doing a children's garden, maybe not planting the flowers that are going to attract lots and lots of wasps, things like that to just keep in mind. Okay, I do want to note some resources for you. So if you haven't read Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy, it's a fantastic read. He has a new book out that I currently have sitting next to me. I haven't had the chance to dive into it yet, called Nature's Best Hope. Many of the pollinator-plant relationships that I mentioned today was from research that came from Pollinators of Native Plants, really great resource there. U of I Extension has a wildflower website that you can go on and look up some different options of native plants. If you're interested in citizen science, there's a whole bunch of different opportunities. I just listed a few, the first few that came to mind. So U of I does have an iPollinate program. There's always Monarch Watch, Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. All right, so in summary, native plants support native pollinators and you can help. And I had to put these pictures in here because I just found this hummingbird clearwing moth in my garden over the weekend, and I was so excited because, as I mentioned earlier, he's one of my favorite pollinators, and he was very patient with me as I sat and took about 50 pictures of him as he sat on these leaves here. But I also want to encourage you just to start making observations, okay? So start opening your eyes, looking for caterpillars, seeing what you can find in your garden. Once you do that, you're probably going to be surprised at the diversity that you already have. Okay, and with that, I know I didn't do a great job leaving time for questions. So I want to thank you for being on the call today. If you do have a specific question, you can always email me. My email is listed on the bottom right here. It's emedvecz@illinois.edu, and I'll put that in the chat box really quick as well. And then I do want to mention that we do have a survey that we would be very appreciative if you took. You can see the link on the screen right now, or if you do have your phone, you can scan the QR code and then fill out the survey that way. And we do want to encourage you to sign up for the next webinar that we have in our Everyday Environment series, which is Natural Lawn Care. That's going to be with Abigail, who's been on the call with me today. So you can go and register for that webinar and join us next week as well. All right. That's all I have.
Thanks, Erin. I think I speak for everyone who's commenting in the chat. Thank you. That was really wonderful. One thing I do want to note is a few people have written in the chat, actually now is a good time for native plant sales, like we were talking, like Erin was talking about. And so if you're part of an organization that's having an upcoming plant sale and you want to put that in the chat, please do so we can learn about it. I know we're from all over the state, so I'm sure we'd love to, some people might be in your area. It's a good time to mention that. Erin, I will email you these questions that I wrote down. So if there are any that are like generally large that you'd like, you know, when you send that follow-up email with the survey, you can put it in there. So
perfect. That sounds great. And I did see a couple people asking for the PowerPoint slides, so I will do my best to at least put some of it together since it is such a large PowerPoint. I'll see what I can do, but hopefully at least send part of it as a follow-up, just so, especially with those relationships at the end. I know that was so much information, but yes, I'll definitely see if I can put something together and send that in the email as well.
Yes, I think that's the thing that people were wondering about especially, so that's awesome. So excellent. Also, I think for I was thinking about this fly thing that it's halteres.
That's the word.
I've been racking my brain the whole time thinking about it. So I was like, I know there's a name. So
well, I'm with you. Yeah, sometimes I mean, there's only so much information I can keep crammed in my head for an hour. So
absolutely. So okay. Well, that's all we have. I think I'll send Erin those questions if anybody's, you know, still on. A lot of people are thanking you and writing in those plant sales that are going on. And we hope to see you next week at the Natural Lawn Care one that I'll be doing. So
yes, definitely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We really appreciate it.